So Soames in Warren was the home of the Massasoit, Hoosimeekman. If you go to Plymouth, you're going to see this statue there. And I'm sure that most people who go to Plymouth think that's where he lived. Makes sense, huh? Because the statue's right here, and there's Plymouth Rock. He lived 40 miles away, okay? And the territory that he led, he wasn't a, he's not an elected leader. He's a leader by consensus. But his territory, as you can see, extended from East Bay really all the way to Plymouth. He signed deeds in this area for many years. The Mass Bay colony came down to the Plymouth colony line, and then the Rhode Island colony only included this area, which includes Aquidneck Island. So give you some idea of where the colonies were and where the tribes were at that time. Another map illustrates what was important in this area was the water connection. Yes, there were trails, but you didn't have wheeled vehicles, okay? And trails were slow and difficult to navigate. And if you were carrying something, you had to carry it on your back. There wasn't any other way to move things. On the other hand, if you get a dugout canoe, it's called a mashoon, you can load deer and anything you want to move into that and go hundreds of miles, really, through the waterways. So that was why this area was so favored by the Poconokeets, and why Canonicus and the Narragansetts wanted to move into the area. They tried numerous times to take over this area, but were never successful. There are a dozen rivers between the Taunton River and the Providence River. And you Rehoboth people, you know about the Palmer, right?
We lived on the Lees for a little while.
Oh, okay, good. It's not the kind of river that you can put a motorboat in, but you can definitely kayak, particularly if the fallen trees have been cut. But you can travel quite a distance well up into Rehoboth there. The Kickamuit, which before the dams, you could get up there, Lees River, Coles River, etc. These all provided excellent means of transportation, which really made the area unique.
Do they have donkeys that they use or any other animals?
No, the only domesticated animal was a dog, which was kind of used for hunting a little bit, but not as a pet in the way we would think of most people keep dogs. That was one of the distinctions between colonial people and native people, is that colonial people domesticated animals and brought them and raised them and didn't depend on hunting for their livelihood, whereas you had just the opposite with the tribes, and a lot of disagreement over that. Right after the Pilgrims landed, and remember half of them died, they had moved into Patuxet, or what we call Plymouth Plantation now, and found nothing but bones on the ground. That people had died of a major plague there in between 1616 and 1619. So there was, though there were native people around observing what was going on, they weren't displaced because they'd already left the area. That plague had a profound effect on the tribes because they lost up to 90% of people in villages all along there. In this area, the East Bay and Providence area, it was not as affected by the plague. We think that there's some possibility that the Massasoit Hoosimeekman lost several of his children during that plague, so that he remarried, and his sons, Wamsutta and Metacom, were probably his second children because he was in his 40s at that time. So the plague had a profound effect on the whole region and really set things up for an agreement with the colonists. Boy, this doesn't stay in one place. This is the treaty, if you will, that was struck in March 21, 1621. So after the Pilgrims had survived that first winter, the Massasoit decided that making friends with them would make sense because they needed to protect themselves from the Narragansetts. And having people who possessed guns was a good idea. In fact, Miles Standish made good on that on several occasions. So we worked out basically a mutual defense treaty that they would protect each other, and they did. That was followed up until the Massasoit's death in '61. The only time the U.S. government's ever recognized that treaty is the backside of the Sacagawea dollar coin. Not all of them. Some of them have this treaty, the peace pipe being handed there. That's it. This document is probably more important than the Declaration of Independence, because this is what allowed the colonists to survive. Had this not been in place, we'd be speaking French or Algonquin. So you have these great population decreases. The Native American population was subject to all kinds of infectious diseases. There was a big smallpox outbreak in 1632. Lost about a quarter of the folks. They were just getting hit wave after wave after wave. Meanwhile, the colonists, who had acquired immunity in Europe, had no problem for the most part. I mean, there were some who did succumb to those diseases. But the worst part was the native population had no idea why this was happening, and their shamans couldn't do anything about it. So they lost a lot of their power, and it made the Europeans look like they possessed a power that they didn't have. When the English first got here, there were about 60,000 native people throughout New England. Okay. By 1650, there were, 1675, there were about 50,000 English people and roughly 10,000 native people. It's a huge power imbalance, right? So you have this whole, some people say, that was deliberate. It's hard to say that, in that no one really understood what was going on. They just saw native people dying in large numbers, whereas Europeans are not as affected, and nobody had an explanation for it. Other than, what's the explanation for anything back then? God's will. That's right. Easy to say that, huh? So there was a lot of trade between the colonists and the native people, to the extent that the native people began to become increasingly dependent on English goods. Remember, you start out in 1620, you're hunting with bows and arrows, and depending on what you find in terms of deer and other animals for food, by 1650, you got a whole new generation who grew up with guns, not bows and arrows, who saw the decreasing number of wildlife and the increasing dependence on raised farm animals, to the extent that even Metacom, toward just before the war, was raising pigs on Hog Island, of course, off of Bristol. There are a lot of hog islands around there. When the Pilgrims, or the Separatists, they didn't call themselves Pilgrims, but the Founding Fathers, when they arrived, they were met by Tisquantum, or Squanto, who, as the lore goes, taught them how to plant corn and, with fish. I always was curious about that because men did not farm. Native men didn't do the farming, the women did. So what's this guy doing telling people how to plant? More than likely, he simply explained what the native women were doing as they did the planting. Okay, so it's a little different story. There's a great new book out called On Squanto, and A Native Odyssey just came out 6 months ago or so. Definitely worth a read. Very, very good. Andrew Lippman had done another book called Saltwater Frontier. Wrote this book, speculating on what Squanto Tisquantum went through in his life. Very interesting.
Well, then Squanto was captured, went to Spain, then went to England, then he came back. So
That's
he was first
right.
in
He
England.
went back actually twice. Yeah, there's a whole.
Then when he came back here, his whole village was decimated,
That's right.
and he died only
But
probably.
having lived in London for 2 years, his English was pretty good.
Great.
Okay, which meant that he could do more than high Englishman and negotiate the treaty. But when you're the translator, you also have a lot of power, and he began using that power to the point that Osamequin was not happy with some of his politics. Yeah.
You mentioned guns,
Yeah.
and so were the colonists okay with letting the Indians, the Native Americans have guns? Or
Oh,
was
yeah.
that-
Yeah, and I mean, there's a great deal of trade in guns at that time. It was only at the point of potential warfare that the English got very nervous about the numbers of guns. They not only had guns, they even had little forges and could repair guns. They couldn't make them, they didn't have that capability. The thing they were dependent on from the English was gunpowder and lead shot. And without that, they were defenseless. So they depended, here you have this growing dependency on English goods, including fabric and lots of tools and things of that sort. So over that period of 50 years, from 1620 to 1670, you see this whole cultural change that took place.
What was the power position of Squanto in the tribe? Was he
Well,
just a person, or
he was
he
just,
a
there was
chief?
no tribe per se when he came back. We think there was a seasonal village, in other words, like any shore location. Native people came and either planted or fished there. But when he first arrived back, the place had been decimated. So it was only as people got more secure with the idea that they weren't going to die if they moved there. The natives thought that the English kept the plague in a box and they could release it any time and kill people.
But I mean, in relation to Osamequin, they were in the same community, or they were in separate cultures and all?
He joined the.
Oh, he was part of his
Part,
group.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
When he left, he was under Osamequin.
Well, okay.
When he came back, he returned to Solms and spent a good deal of time in the Warren area there.
So Squanto was a Pocono.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Well, he was a Patuxet, but the Patuxets were under the agreement of the Poconokas. The Poconokas had 60 tribes under their leadership, and he was under Massasoit's leadership when he was captured. So he was returning to a place that was familiar and that people accepted him. Quite a story. Somebody should make a movie about it. What's wrong with this picture? everything.
It was painted in this century. It
Pardon me?
was probably painted in this century.
Oh, yeah.
Well, the Indians, more like the plain Indians over there, they
That's
log
right.
cabin in the back.
This is not,
That's not the car.
yeah, this is not the right headdress. How many women, colonial women do you see in there?
Yeah.
There are 5 of them. There were only 4 alive at the time, so they got the count wrong. And what's this colonial woman talking with a native woman? They couldn't talk. You know, maybe gestures or something of that sort. But this was part of the lore that has been created over the years, and unfortunately, we still have vestiges of that in our schools. I hope children are no longer being dressed up as pilgrims and Indians at Thanksgiving. But I'll tell you, the time I get the most number of calls is November. Oh, can't we get somebody from the tribe to come and talk? You know? And I keep saying, you know, there's the rest of the year. You know? Why doesn't somebody celebrate the treaty in March? That would be a far more appropriate kind of thing to do. But it's tough. These curricula are set in stone, and they don't change easily. Here's our friend Miles Standish, who made good on after he learned that the Massachusetts tribe up around Weymouth, and an area that was settled called Wessagusset, was in fact planning to raid Plymouth and wipe them out, and could very well have done that. I mean, you know, Plymouth was pretty much defenseless. But Miles got word from Osamequin and did a preemptive strike, went up there, and there's a whole story about how he lured the other tribe into a dinner and then exploded in that dinner and stabbed people to death. But Miles was known as a hothead, and he was also very short. They called him Shrimp. They had to make a shorter sword because the regular sword hit the ground. Anyway, he was an interesting character and really led all the military exploits at the time.
How many different languages were the different tribes?
They're all Algonquin family languages,
So they understand each other?
they could understand one another. Yeah, it's, yeah, maybe the difference between New England dialect and Southern dialect along those lines. Not the difference between Spanish and French, but
So I'm curious or interested in, there seems to be so much friction between the various tribes, which is, was surprising. Well, I shouldn't say surprising, I didn't know about that. I kind of thought that maybe they were, all got along and they had their agreements and, you know.
well,
you'll have the
they
land up
did
to
for the most
stream.
part, and they did have agreements, and things, territories would change over time and things of that sort. What they didn't do was what the Europeans were doing all the time, particularly around this time, which is to have these all-out wars and try to kill each other. That was never the objective of the native tribes. The objective was to take over territory, and in some cases bring other tribe members from another tribe into your tribe, but you wanted them alive. So, you know, not to say there weren't occasions when someone was killed in some kind of skirmish, but it was very different from the English troops' idea that you kill as many of the enemy as possible. Very, very different. And there's negotiation going on all the time. The key ability of the Massasoit to bring, you imagine, 60 tribes, sub-tribes, clans, all into agreement, and they weren't always in agreement. And a number of them, Corbitant in what was called Mattapoisett, now Swansea, was very much against the idea of allying with the English, but he was persuaded and joined in at that point. So you had to be a really good statesman in order to keep things moving in the right direction.
Where were the Picassets from? Picasset tribe?
Yeah,
Were they?
Tiverton and that area, yeah.
Okay.
In fact, they just recently did a little land exchange, I don't know if you read about that in the paper. And they talk about the King Philip War was fought in the swamp there. It's still a swamp.
It is.
Try going through it sometime.
Another question, the Algonquins, that's referenced several times, so they seem to have a higher position, or is that where many of these tribes fall under in terms of hierarchy?
When you say the Algonquins, that's the entire eastern seaboard is Algonquin in terms of its language and culture.
Is the Algonquin a tribe, a culture, or a language?
It's
All the
language,
above?
The language, yeah. But there are Algonquin-speaking tribes, but there's no Algonquin tribe, a single
Okay.
tribe.
Well,
Do you have a chart you can give us? I mean, in reading that book, I was
Yes.
like, it was bananas, you know, trying to see who was a chief of each one, and which
Right.
were under which, and which were allied with which, and then, I mean, it's overwhelming, but is there like a nice chart, you know?
I don't know
Cheat sheet or
one.
something?
And the hard part is that it changed over time, so you can talk about one point in time. And this is all from the English point of view. Nobody was writing anything from the tribal point of view. So it would be very difficult to do anything other than speculate about something.
the book mentions the Iroquois
Yeah?
as, I don't know, like bad guys, you know,
Well, they've,
they're preying on the other tribes.
Sure.
Mohawks,
yeah, the Mohawks and, right, there were more aggressive tribes than others. And we'll talk a little bit about the Pequot War, and the Pequots were well known as very aggressive. But it just depended on your point of view, and who you were and what you're trying to protect.
David had a map from one of the books on this one,
Yep.
and labeled where the tribes were, and the other green ones were actually a little bit ahead of us on this one. And some of the striking points were during the war itself. And pass that around, they can see where the different tribes were overlapping.
Well, you've got, yes, I was gonna say you have names there, but
Right, right,
you don't know exactly
right,
where they were and what, yeah. And that things would change over time.
yes.
But if that helps in terms of kind of a list of who was around at
Yeah,
the
I
time.
mean,
This
it's,
was dated us, this is
Yep.
1675.
Yep, we'll talk some more about that as we go along.
Isn't
Another
it
book.
pretty much geographic in their associations? I always think of it as northern Rhode Island into Plymouth. I can't,
Right.
you know, north of Newport. And then the river, and on the other side of the river, we
Right.
had another group of tribes who would like to have come across. We have proof of that in East Providence, but never really made it. And then the group across the town of
Right.
Massachusetts.
Yeah.
It's almost like 3 locations.
You will not find a map that has hard lines.
Yeah.
And because things changed over time, and natural features like rivers were often dividing lines for a time,
Yeah.
and that might change. So we're looking for, from our point of view, we want a map with solid state lines, and we want to know where our territory ends and where Canada and Mexico pick up from there. It's just not that way then, and the English spent a lot of the time trying to figure out who's in charge here. And of course, they always just looked at men. They couldn't countenance the idea that a woman like Weedemoo or Ashwansons would be in charge of any political body.
David, well, even the states too, Rhode Island didn't know its boundaries, as did Connecticut. Rhode Island was afraid of Connecticut coming in, and Massachusetts expanded way out. So there's no definitive lines back
Oh,
then.
absolutely. And remember the area that we now call Bristol County, Rhode Island, those lines changed in 1747. There's a whole land swap that went on, so it's difficult to know without precise information on a particular area. So getting back to 1623, pass that along. The Massasoit was Ed Winslow, who was the Plymouth Secretary of State, heard that the Massasoit was on his deathbed. This was not a good thing, because if he were to die, that treaty would no longer be in effect, and all kinds of problems would come out of that. So Winslow quickly, with Hampden, came down and visited Winslow. That's his second visit. He came in 21 after the treaty was signed in March. He came in July. But then 2 years later, we know that he came in 1623 when the Massasoit was gravely ill. And if you read the story, it's, he administered everything and tried to do chicken soup, but they couldn't get the chickens in time. But the Massasoit recovered and said, King Winslow will be friends for life. And he meant it. And that relationship was one of the major reasons why things stayed as they were, at least until Ed Winslow left in 44. And then things began to deteriorate when his son, Josiah, became governor in 63. And he did not get along with Metacom at all. So they were changing politics over that period of time. But I think you can safely say those first 10 years were pretty much peaceful and supportive of one another. They each needed each other for various reasons, so there was a mutual dependency there. That began to change, though. And remember, 1630, you get 1,000 people coming from England in one summer. Just unbelievable numbers. And then they started having children, and of course you have to get more land as you have more kids, and things really deteriorated from that point on.
So
What's
what
that
was the-
thing? Oh, excuse me.
I was saying, what was the purpose of that broadside on the right? Was that propaganda?
That, well, yeah, that was Ed Winslow, who was a printer in England, so he was very much concerned with how the crown and the people back in England were understanding what was happening here, and so he wanted to tell these stories. This was published in 1622, and it became a very popular book. So what he wanted to do is to make sure that people in Europe were supportive of this experiment and having people who had come through the Netherlands, but were British people, establishing something.
What is that thing the person on the end is holding? Is that a lamp, or is that some religious?
I would think, yeah, more. I've never heard an explanation of what it is, but whoever the artist was trying to show some kind of native life in that regard. They do have it right that when you're sick and on your deathbed, everybody you know comes. Of course, if you're dying of an infectious disease, that's not such a good thing, is it? Little did they know. 1636, war breaks out in southern Connecticut around Mystic. There's a whole story that goes with it. I won't go into a lot of detail on that, but essentially what happened was that the United Colonies, all but Rhode Island, joined forces and wiped out essentially the entire Pequot tribe, burning over 400 women and children alive in one of their raids. When word got back to Somes and in particular to Narragansett tribe, they were incensed by that and had a very different view of what, of the English. The English were doing what English people did in England. No one did this kind of thing. None of the native tribes would ever consider doing what happened there. Then that gets repeated again during the King Philip War at the Great Swamp Massacre. And so you begin to see a difference in terms of how life was valued and how military exploits took place. It was, as I mentioned, a more expansive settlement and more encroachment. Native people were losing their lands. They would grow corn, beans, and squash, but the Three Sisters could do that pretty successfully just about anywhere. And when Verrazano came in 1524, I'm sorry, he described league upon league upon league of open land. By burning the forest, they were able to clear the land and plant tremendous amounts of food in this agricultural society. So even among the tribes, the idea of having to move dozens or hundreds of miles in order to resupply began to change. And that from roughly 1300 on, people were more dependent on growing their own corn and being sustained by that. And remember, you could grow corn, dry it, and store it, so you had food through the winter. So even dependency on hunting diminished greatly over that time. The English, however, brought animals who liked to do what? Eat corn. And they didn't believe in fencing. They said the Indians, they should put the fence around their garden. We don't put the fence around our animals, we let our animals roam. Well, if you want more land for your kids, let your cows and your pigs do the work for you, and they'll take care of clearing some land. So you can begin to understand what people here thought of the English. As I mentioned, this difference in terms of the difference between hunting and raising animals, but even Metacom, toward just before the war, he was known to have quite a number of hogs on Hog Island there. Easy thing, you just put your hog in a machine, paddle out there, let them go in the spring, and then come back in the fall. And of course, they would ruin the island there. Pigs are just enormous bulldozers when it comes to clam beds, and they could dig up acres of clam beds. But if there's nobody else on the island, who cares, huh?
Yeah, speaking of clams, well, I don't understand the value of the wampum, which was traded as money, from what I gather.
Well, initially not. Wampum was a sacred item, and it was used, the wampum belts were used to tell stories and keep their recorded history.
So would they take clam shells and then polish them? Or
Yeah,
ship them?
you'd have to, I don't know how they did it, I mean, but they would break the clamshell into small pieces, and then they didn't have iron tools,
Right.
so they would have to drill a hole in the clamshell, usually with a stone tool. Amazing work, and would make these wampum belts that were yards long, and were used in sacred ceremonies.
Well, the book refers to different payments, 2 fathoms of wampum. And isn't a fathom like a measure of depth?
6 feet.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's 6 feet or so. Yeah.
6 feet? So does that mean it's a pile of wampum 6 feet by?
A belt that long, right? I know. Imagine the work that it took. Eventually, the English in Connecticut began to manufacture their own wampum, and using iron tools, it could be a lot quicker at it. And it was used as an exchange. You also have to remember that, you know, the European notion is that you buy something, you purchase something with money, okay? That was the way you exchange things. Native people didn't do that. You would trade, and if you were given something, you might give something back, okay, in recognition of a gift that you received. But that's very different from this kind of monetary, you know, so many dollars equals something of value in that regard. Eventually, it began to catch on and do things the European way. Yeah.
David, we keep saying Medicom, other books mention PU Medicom, Pu Medicom.
Medicom,
Medicom,
P-O, yeah. That just means of Medicom.
Okay, so which way do you gravitate towards, Medicom or
I use Medicom.
Medicom?
You can use Medicomet.
Medicom, right?
And names were also kind of slippery. People would change names over the course of their life. And you know, with both Philip and Alexander, they got their names given to them by request of the Plymouth Court because they wanted to have equivalency with the King of England. So you'd be King Philip, which totally confuses people today when you hear about King Philip's War.
The question back to the wampum. I used to work in Boston Harbor in the 80s, and that was before the big dig, and the harbor islands were, it was really easy to spot these kitchen midden piles, you know,
Huge middens.
enormous, you know,
Yeah.
but then they did the big dig and now it's all covered with,
Right.
you know, fill. But I'm wondering, in your area in Soames, can you find spots where you have these middens that are still around?
I don't know of any inland homes that are existing. We think there were some, if you go to Soames Woods, they found some, they did a dig there in the 90s and did locate some hearths that were there. They don't want you to know where they are, so yeah. And there were other archaeological digs. This one at the end of Narrows Road and at the Narrows in Bristol, the opening of the Kickamuit River into the Monroe Bay. And that was again done in the 90s. Archaeologists are very protective of their sources, if you will, and they may go in and do a dig, but then they cover everything up, and then they don't tell anybody where they were. Okay. I mean, just in general, it's a big dot, you know, somewhere in here, but that's all we know. Let me just wrap up in the next 5 minutes here. We'll take a break, and then we'll pick up from there. So you have all these cultural exchanges, Native people being very interested in European goods to some extent, but they would do things like, you get a copper pot, and what would you do with the copper pot? Would you use it to cook? No, you cut it up into little pieces and you make jewelry out of it. So there was a lot of that going on. Oops. Much in the way of religious conversion. This was part of what was going on, particularly from 1650 up until the King Philip War. You have John Eliot, who interestingly managed to employ a number of Nipmuc translators who worked where? What university then? Abbott. That was the Indian school, remember? That's how it started. And they produced an entire translated Bible in Algonquin, which you can go look at now if you want. In fact, it's being used down in the Cape for English revitalization, native language revitalization project, because you have all the words in the Bible translated into Algonquin at the time. So you can pretty much put things together. You have to make up some new words, but it was really the one way that the Algonquin language survived. Not that people were speaking it necessarily, but there was a written version of it.
What was the alphabet that was used?
Uh,
Was it an English alphabet phonetically?
There's a phonetic number of symbols and letters. You can get a good idea of that if you look at Roger Williams' Key to the Languages of America. He will have things written out. He has to use, there are letters like Usamiquan. The first letter looks like a figure 8. Okay, that's the oo sound, because there isn't an oo sound in the English language. So it's a combination of both English letters and other phonetic letters that were made up to replicate the sounds. 14 praying towns scattered. Want to pay attention to where these praying towns were and where the war broke out. Okay, this is a high correspondence between the two. Praying towns were ethnic cleansing towns. Okay. They're clearly, it wasn't just a matter of conversion to Christianity, it was conversion to the English way of life, including men had to cut their hair, which was totally against anything they believed. You had to dress in English clothing, you had to live in English houses, okay? I don't think anyone would get away with that today, although I guess the Chinese are still working on the Uyghurs, you know. It's the same idea, okay? And done with no awareness of the damage that we're doing, and because they strongly believed that a converted native person converted to Christianity and English way of life was a good thing. Okay, why don't I stop at this point, we'll come back, we'll pick up from here, and let's take a 5, no more than 10-minute break here. And, we were just talking about intertribal alliances, and actually the presence of Europeans here created more interest on the part of the tribes to align with one another. They never were really successful at that, however, so that, well, the English developed what was called the United Colonies, where they brought the different English groups together under single leadership. That never really happened among the various tribes. And that made it difficult for Metacom to get his alliance when he wanted to bring other tribes in. He was successful with 3 other tribes, and that was it. And tried later on in the war to get the Mohegans. The Narragansetts joined after a great swamp fight. But you have to imagine not only the cultural differences and the histories among the different tribes, but the communication capacities. There weren't cell phones then. People, you had to travel to talk to somebody, and that takes time. The English had the advantage of writing. They could send a letter out to people. They didn't have to do all that traveling. And that proved to be a major problem during the war. Okay.
What were the other tribes that Metacom aligned with prior to that?
Primarily the Nipmucks, which are in central Massachusetts, Worcester area. The Patumcuts, which is north of them, and I'm trying to think of the one other. Of course, the Pecasets in this region as well. But his efforts were tenuous at best. And in fact, a lot of people would make the assertion that he didn't so much have an alliance as there were many different tribes who had many of their own beefs with the English and wanted to have war on their own terms. So it's not that it was a coordinated effort, but it was a parallel effort among different tribes at the same time. And you had tribes who joined with the English, remember, particularly on the Cape. They remained neutral, and some of the tribes along the eastern shore went joined up with the English during the war. So it was tribe member against tribe member in many cases.
So you mentioned that Squanto went back to England for a while. And I remember Roger Williams went back a few times, you know. To me, that's mind-boggling, because it wasn't like they got to fly over, you know. So how did that,
Spent a month or 6 weeks.
just
Well,
getting there, yeah?
In Roger Williams' case, he had the ability to, he wrote Key to the Languages of America on his trip in '63. I mean, it's a great place to have nothing else to do and no distractions. You can write books, you know. But you're right, and Tisquam, remember, he gets captured by Dermer and taken into slavery, along with 21 others, natives from the Cape, from the Nauset tribe, and has no idea how to get back, but manages to get to England, and then discovers some of the ship captains who were going to New England, and actually had 2 voyages back and forth there. So he got around, you know. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, but I think to some degree we downplay the capacity of people in these slow ships, you know, going 2 knots an hour, you know, that kind of thing. People had time. You know, it's not like we're in a hurry. They weren't in the same kind of hurry, and so you could spend a month at sea as long as you got to where you're going. And a lot of ships didn't. So
I have a question. I know Roger Williams had, or at least I think I know, had good relations with the Native Americans. And the book makes him seem, at least the parts I read, makes him seem almost like an ambassador or a go-between.
oh, yeah, and
Did he travel around like making peace between people?
he tried to head off the King Philip War. Yeah, because of his language skills. You have to remember, Roger grew up in London, you know, the whole story. I've got a video on the website that Charlotte Carrington Farmer from Roger Williams University, she's just published a book, and she's speaking in a lot of different places. You can go here at different libraries around here, but if you look at the video of that, you will hear her talk about what it was like for Roger to grow up in London, where as a kid he's within 100 yards of where they're burning people alive, okay, and begins to kind of sour on the whole English way of life and says, oh, I could go to America, maybe we can get it right over there. His father was a cloth merchant, and Roger as a kid would go down to the docks when the ships would come in from India and other places, and he was able to learn enough of the various languages like Hindi in order to negotiate with the guys on the ships before the captain was making sales, so he'd get the best deals. He was a master of languages, and when he worked for Loud and other people and invented shorthand, his own shorthand, and was able to transcribe. So, amazing guy, really worth looking into. Yeah.
I have to put a plug in from Cumberland, so William Blackstone predated
Yes,
Roger Williams,
like
yeah.
2 years.
And they were friends, communicated, and actually Blackstone had a bigger library than
Yep.
did Roger Williams.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting. I have a whole-
Which he had to carry down on his
And
ox.
it's ox.
And of course, you've got a statue now that is in contention with the Narragansetts who don't like the idea that this European white guy's coming down here and claiming territory and all that. And he's not going to bring his library all by himself, is he? You know, he's going to get help. What kind of help do you get in 1634? You hire native people. What do you call hiring a native person?
Slavery.
Slavery, servitude, right?
We had his manservant, Abbott. We have a road in Cumberland, Abbott Ron Valley Road,
Yep.
named after the servant.
Oh, yeah.
It's fascinating when he studied, made his own place, we call it Study Hill, if you're familiar with
Yes,
Cumberland.
right.
And Hope is situated right now. That's where he was, at his place, he had about 40, 50, 60, 100 acres over there. So it's fascinating, so I
Yeah, it is.
did some literature on that.
Has anybody in this LLC ever done a course on Roger Williams? Somebody should.
Not much, but
Not much?
I've done some because he came to Rumford first,
Yes.
and we always refer to it as his first stop.
There is a course called Historical Novels, and which I took the first time it was offered, and one of the books was I, Roger Williams.
Oh, okay.
There's a gentleman that goes around and portrays Roger Williams. He came to Cumberland, one of our sites up there.
Oh, yeah, it's
He
John.
did that. He was at the Historic Society in Providence, I think
Yeah.
last year. Then he came to Cumberland, did an excellent job.
Yes. Oh, he just he was a park ranger, but he just retired. He's
Right.
still doing that. He was down a couple weeks ago at the tavern
Yes,
in Providence,
Yeah.
doing it with Charlotte. The two of them often work together. They've taken tours over to England with students and all kinds of stuff. Whole other course. Okay. So, differences in legal systems. The English, of course, had borrowed a lot of the court systems from Europe going back for centuries. So there's a long history of how you adjudicate any difficulties between people. And the idea was that the state was the one that would bring about justice. Very different from native point of view, that justice was usually meted out between two persons, two individuals, within the tribe, in the tribal context, and often with the assistance of tribal leaders. But it was never given over to another authority, even in cases of murder. That was something to be solved internally, within the family, if you will, as opposed to between the state and the defendants in that regard. So it was difficult for people to understand what the law meant and how you work out conflicts. We talked a little earlier about the praying towns. The whole idea was that you would make cultural transformations over time. You've all heard of the boarding schools. And these are not pictures from the 1700s in cameras, but you get the same notion. This was going on up until the 1960s in this country, and but it was the same idea that you destroy the Indian but keep the man, that kind of thing. And you see just in the photographs how the transformations that took place. It was just about 6 months ago that our then president apologized for all that. Okay. Anybody been to Canada? Where they've been working on this for years and have done a very good job. They still got work to do, but it's more than just a statement of apology. It's a whole reinterpretation of what went on and to understand this whole idea that of cultural appropriation. You can't do that.
There's an interesting movie that people might have seen, American Fiction, and talking about appropriation, who gets to tell the story, and forcing people to present a kind of, culture that isn't legit or isn't,
Right?
who gets to tell my story.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's still going on. So population changes, I think you can see that if you follow the green line of Native Americans, that starting in 1620, this is you can pick a number. Native people weren't doing censuses then. They didn't have a report in terms of how many people. These are various guesses, but somewhere between 60 and 100,000 people. Okay. But that population, as you can see, by 1630, it dropped considerably, okay, just in those first 10 years, and then stayed very low over that time. Meanwhile, the white European population was just exploding and taking off. So by, in this case, 1750, you have 300,000 Europeans here. But even by 1675, there's a huge difference here in terms of numbers. And this is because it took 2 generations to occur. It's not like people were constantly thinking about that. It's just the way things were. That suddenly, you know, the native people are no longer as present as they once were. Yeah.
Brings up the question that I had read in another book over here. If the disease didn't take 80-90% of the Wampanoags, would the colonists have been able to land and settle there at the time?
Right?
So you're talking, so in fact, I asked the statistics over here, it said, statistics, Wampanoags had approximately 69 villages, approximately 1,000 people per village, for approximately 70,000 in the entire region. Using 80% death rate, 56,000 Indians died in a 2-year period, 2,333 died each month, 583 died each week, while 83 died every day. There were no prayers, ceremonies, herbs, cure, or miracles.
So there's an attempt to kind of calculate what the population changes would have been.
It is also interesting too, when you read the book, different approach, and this one,
I have all of
colonization,
those, yep.
Coombs, and this is interesting. The old song, "This land is their land."
David Silverman, right?
David Silverman.
He's
And
married to Julie Fisher, who's also done a number of books on this. There's a whole set of authors who
it's interesting, but their approach is entirely different. When you read about Thanksgiving,
yeah.
there's a lot of history behind it. You have a different perspective
Right.
when you read Coombs on top of it.
Well, Linda is strongly Aquina, would not agree with anything that I say, and has told me so. She defends the what I call the new Wampanoag version of things. But she has a right to do that, as does anybody who grew up in any particular culture to tell their story from their point of view. But the Narragansetts won't agree with her, and so. And nobody agrees with both of us. Pardon me?
Those 2 cultures just never did agree.
No, right. Yeah, nothing's changed in 400 years, right?
Is this typical of this area only, or was it all of the colonies?
In terms of people
The
disagreeing?
problems that were happening and the way they were handling them.
Oh, there were problems in a lot of places. Go back to Jamestown. I mean, that was, you think things are bad here?
Yeah.
Take a look there, right? No, and the English really had no sense of how to be diplomatic, if you will, except for Edmunds, who I admire greatly, because he really did have, from an English point of view, a real curiosity about other cultures and an attempt to understand what was going on. But unfortunately, he wasn't able to pass that to his son, Josiah, and then he ended up in the war. This is a map I put together so you get some idea of what was going on. This was all Somes, all native territory, but starting in 1653, Moiset, and then 63 at Malcolm Hill, and even down here in Dewisset in Warren, we've had Hugh Cole setting up farms here, the Garrison House, Miles Garrison House here, and another Garrison House in that place. The whole world around just north of, this is Bristol, and there was a fence line across here to keep the English cows from raiding the native cornfields. And by the time of the war, Philip had moved down to Mount Hope. His father was up there in Warren. Go to Warren, there's a little, at the end of Baker Street, there's the Massasoit Spring. They're working on refurbishing that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
distract. So we have stone walls all over our property in Rehoboth, and we're told that they had been built by, after the King Philip's War, the native indigenous population had been enslaved, and they were made to clear land and build these walls.
Sure.
But you're making me wonder if some of those were intentionally built by individuals trying to keep cows out.
yeah, probably not.
No, okay.
Native people built stone effigies and would do things like a snake rock. You can find some of these, if you go on my website and look at, you'll find there's places in Tiverton, in Little Compton, where if you know where to look and you know what you're looking at, you will find these rock, I guess you call them sculptures, that would look like a fence line, except they go like this. Okay. Those were the only structures, if you want to call it a permanent structure, that Native people made. They didn't carve, they didn't have iron tools. More typically, they would find places and assign cultural significance to them. So large rocks, outcroppings, anything at the top of a hill, those were often considered ceremonial. That's why the European eye doesn't see what the native eye saw. And that's why it's so hard for people to say, well, if the civilization was here for 10,000 years, where's all their stuff? And, well, they didn't do that. Okay. I compare Patumtuck in Bristol, the Mount Hope, the seat of Metacom there, which is a huge quartz outcropping at the top of a hill. And who is to say that you drive, you see it every day from where you live. That's very similar to the Acropolis in Athens, which was a natural stone outcropping, okay? But the Greeks built structures, and now we have the Acropolis building on top of us. But it was originally just a found hillock there within the city, and you find that all over the world, that high places are often ascribed special ceremonial significance. That's the way things are here. So, before the outbreak of the war, you've got this whole group of English settlements with a fence line here protecting now only about 700 native people just before the outbreak of the war, who were very fearful that the English were going to move into their territory too.
Who built that fence?
Pardon me?
Who built that fence?
It
Was the
would have
English-
been the native people
Oh,
that
okay.
fenced, because they were trying to protect
Okay.
their crops from the English animals.
What materials did they use?
Split wood,
Okay.
pretty much, yeah. Not that we have a picture of it.
Right.
That's what was in common usage. And not terribly effective either. The cows have a way of getting over just about anything if they're hungry. There was even an effort by Tom Willett, who purchased property in 1653 from Moosomequin. He had thought about Bristol as being an ideal port. I didn't realize why Bristol was called Bristol until I went to Bristol, England. And has anybody been there? It's on a river, and you have the same kind of view. You're looking across water at moorland on the other side of the river, and it could have been a deep water port, at least deep enough for the ships that they had at the time. So here's Moosomequin. Philip becoming increasingly protective of his territory. And then he hears about, oh, we like your port. It's kind of like taking over Gaza, it's like whatever you want. It's all real estate transactions, right? So we talked about encroachment with the 1,000 pigs, and infectious disease. Osamequin dies in 1661. He was living with the Nipmucks up near Brookfield at the time. They carried his body back to today's Warren to bury him in the royal burial ground. We know he was buried there because the English had given Osamequin a copper chain necklace and a red horseman's coat with gold lace. When they opened one of the graves at Burrs Hill, Virginia Baker reports that they found the copper chain necklace and some of the gold lace. That copper chain necklace is a picture of it. I presume it's back reburied because it first went to Heffenrecher in Bristol, but it should have been returned in 2017 to the Mashpees, who were reburying things there. So that should be where it is. But that's enough evidence in my book that that copper chain necklace would not have been given to someone else. It would have been put in Massasoit's grave. So after his death, Wamsutta, his oldest son at the time, takes over leadership, but he's called to Plymouth, and then on his way back, he becomes violently ill and dies. And nobody knows why. A healthy man in his 40s is going to suddenly die. But from that point on, Philip, his younger brother, who was only like 22 at the time, and takes over, was always suspicious of the English. Just this is a good illustration. By the way, you have all of this. All of the slides are in the handout here, so if it helps to look at that. If you see the timeline here, where Osamequin, who was born in about 1590 and dies in 1661. You see at the same time, you've got Winslow meets Osamequin when he was 26. And then his son's born in 23, but he becomes governor at age 50. In the meantime, Osamequin is dead. Winslow has left, and he actually got killed in a war. He left in 44 and dies at age 60. So you have these intergenerational changes, and that's really important in terms of understanding what was going on. The world of 1675 was not like the world of 1660. A lot had changed, and the leadership had changed, and then the attitudes had changed. And Josiah, who grew up among Native people, did not follow the agreement that his father, Ed Winslow, had made. He saw the English as, we've taken over, we don't need to get along with the Native people anymore. So there was a whole attitude change at the time.
Was there something that made him mad at his mom that you know of?
Was there something that made Josiah mad? I think it was more a power grab. I think it was more he loved buying property and giving it away, and Philip. Remember, Philip did not recall a time before the English like his father. He grew up under the English all the time, and the English got more and more brazen and bold in terms of their demands, so that he began to see the English as somebody you don't want to deal with. And as they made more and more demands over time, he he began to feel like if we don't go to war, I will no longer exist. And that's pretty much the case. So after Massasoit's death, the son received, by the way, his death in 62. We're not sure if it was 60, 61, or 62. I picked the one in the middle, 61. He believed, Philip believed that the colonists were no longer honoring the treaties. And the demand for Wampanoag or Okanoka disarmament further strained relations. So things go from bad to worse. We'll finish up with some of the immediate causes of the war. The one that's mentioned most often is the death of John Sassamon. Sassamon was a praying native Indian. He was actually a Nipmuc, and he had been educated at Harvard, and he tried to convert Philip, but Philip didn't want anything of this Christianity. I don't know what kind of arguments he would have used. It's not, we're doing so well. He's discovered in January under the ice at Matapoisett. 3 native men observe someone pushing him under the ice. So the next thing you know, 3 men are hauled into court. Now, given the original treaty of 1621, who was supposed to adjudicate that death?
The Indians.
Native people, right.
Or they don't like the name Indian, sometimes they want to call it indigenous as opposed to.
No. Indian people use the word Indian too. So, just as long as you don't confuse it with people from India in the East. Okay. He should have been tried by the tribes. And the English demanded that he be tried in their court. And then they placed some native people on the jury just to make it look good. It wasn't very long before they decided that these guys were guilty, and they sentenced them to hanging. 2 of them hung, but the 3rd one, the rope broke, and then they ended up executing him, shooting him a few weeks later. But in any case, it was the way that justice was done that really incensed the native people.
I'm just curious as to why they got involved in this, why the trial mattered to the colonists, or what you call that they. So they did
Why
consider.
didn't they just let it go?
Yeah, they did
Yeah.
consider Sassamon a colleague of a peer, since he had been converted. He was a praying Indian.
Yeah, well, he was, you would say half English, in a sense. He was more English than he was native.
Didn't Sassamon warn the people in Plymouth that there was going to be a war planned?
Yeah.
Like that, I mean, the colonists really thought that Sassamon did them a solid favor, and they were going to take revenge for that.
Yeah. Well, and they thought he was murdered because he spoke too much. So following that execution, this was in June of 1675. So this is right before the war breaks out. And there's a great book on igniting King Philip's War that, if you'd like to get into some of the detail on that, does a very good job of explaining all the ins and outs of that particular episode and why it would have angered you. It wasn't just Philip who was angered, it was all of the native people. And as you'll learn next week, the war breaks out not because Philip decides to, because some of his warriors decide to. So you have a whole culture now. Yep.
I think you need a little more background too. Eating cones, you find out that the Pilgrims originally destination was Virginia. They landed at Cape Cod illegally, with their illegal right on top of that. Before they were at Plymouth, they actually stopped some other spots, and they said they had interchange with Indians at the time. They actually desecrated some of the Indian graves over there at Cape Cod before they landed at
Oh, yeah.
Plymouth.
They stole some of the corn.
Right, stole some of the corn and things like this one, so
Right.
it sort of precedes this. So you say, well, they were illegally to start with, then you come up with this charter, then they redo the charter on top of it. And their whole goal was to make money for this other organization back,
Right.
colonial.
The adventures are
Get the
adventures.
fur and the fish and everything else and ship it back.
Sure.
Sets a different stage when you look at the, then you look
Yeah,
at
yeah,
Thanksgiving.
the story about seeking religious freedom kind of fades after a while when you begin to understand everything that was going on.
Yeah, when she goes in much more detail, when you read it on this one, the different stops they made before they actually settled in Plymouth.
Yeah,
at the time.
they arrive in November, but they don't really go ashore until late December. And they're dying, about one death a day during some parts of the winter there.
And as you mentioned before, the Indians retreated inland at the time, so the Indians were not there. And then the colonists
Well,
actually took over some of the spots.
They wouldn't have been there because of the Great Dying anyway.
Right.
But you're right, that at that time of year, you wouldn't expect to find tribes on the coast.
Right.
Yeah, they would move inland. Yeah. That's where the firewood is, right? So we're just about at the start of the war. So after we get the Sassamon trial, John Easton, who's a Quaker lieutenant governor of Rhode Island, he decides that he's going to see what he can do to talk them out of going to war, and meets essentially at Tripp's Ferry, which is where the Mount Hope Bridge is, kind of on the Mount Hope side down here. There's obviously nothing there from Tripp's Ferry, but that was the place where you could easily get, most easily from Portsmouth over to Bristol by Meshume. So Philip agrees to meet, and you've got the paper in your packet there, the description of John Easton's, I guess it's over here. This one. Well, I'm not going to read this, but you can at your leisure. But it's the time when Philip lays it all out in terms of what the justification for the war is. These are all the things that the English have, and that when the English first come, it was like they were a child that needed help, and we gave them help. And now we need help, and we're not getting anything back from them. So we've got Betsy Kasdan, who was a Quaker historian. Anybody know Betsy by any chance? She's going to be talking on April 23rd at the Rogers Library in Bristol, and she's going to describe that meeting and the attempt to head off the war. It was the last chance that people had been hearing rumors of war for 10 years or more, and at this last minute, I don't think the English people were taking anything that seriously. They heard rumors before. But Easton tries to understand what Philip was upset about, and he spells it out very clearly. But it was only a week later that some of his warriors decided that they had had enough of these wandering cows, and so they go over to Joe Winslow's farm, which is right along the Kickamuit River, near the Kickamuit Middle School, if you know where that is, and start rifling through the farm and didn't kill anybody. Just, shot a couple cows and nothing like that. So that's where we're gonna pick up next week in terms of the details of what happened when the war first broke out.
How far do you want us to go for in the book?
Well, you could read the whole book if you want.
Oh, yeah, right.
But I think into the course of the war, I don't have an exact page number. But I would say just read us on page 51, the war spreads, and then the war widens on page 61, that full chapter. We'll get into some of the details of the war, but the following session will be on the whole course of the war and how it really left this area and moved all the way to western Massachusetts, really almost to New York and down to Connecticut.
Dave, I read the Greek name Philip means lover of horses, and the governor of Massachusetts actually gave Philip a black stallion. I didn't read that in the other Mandel book. So I kept figuring, how does he get from point A to point B? So it takes us 2-3 hours to get from here to here.
Yeah, it's a little easier if you have a horse. Yeah.
Right, but it doesn't really mention the Indians attacking any of the postal horses or anything like that.
No, there's very little mention of horses, and I don't think there were a lot of horses around then.
They came in, I think, 1625 to
Yeah.
Pilgrim Farm in.
But you don't get the sense that people were traveling by horseback.
Right.
Again, really up until the outbreak of the war, most long-distance travel was by car. Not like there are horse-drawn carriages going. That's another 100 years. People are mostly traveling along the coast and not going very far inland. Even horses require something in the way of a wide enough path. You had footpaths that were worn for thousands of years. They also, the native people had the ability to get 40 miles and back in a day. Okay, I mean, think about our long-distance marathon runners. These guys were in good shape, and you can communicate also by smoke signal. Okay, so we think cell phones are great. They go up on top of Mount Hope and communicate with Mount Monadnock and then Mount Wachusett up in so within 20-30 minutes, you're telling people 3 states away what's going on. Not bad. So why do you need electronics? But yeah, it's difficult to imagine how people communicated effectively, and the likelihood is, in a lot of ways, they didn't. That there were misinterpretations. You tell someone to tell somebody, the game of telephone, by the time they get there, it's a little different story, and by the time they get back, it's even more different. So you have to understand some of the major barriers to that. Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead. Oh, this is a question, I don't even know how to form it. The book alludes to there being relationships between King Charles II in England and some of the tribes, and that some of the colonists feared that because they had been the perpetrators of the first execution, or were in sympathy. How did that play a role in all of this and the change once Josiah and once there were children in control?
Again, there's a lot of communication back and forth with England. Lots of people went back after the interregnum period in England. So people were English people were very attuned to what was going on in England at the time. And when the politics changed there, they changed here as well. So you really have to look at both points of view in that regard. Charles II was a lot looser, if you will. Remember, he was the one that authorized Roger Williams to do the lively experiment down here. You know? Go ahead, you know. You don't have to have any rules. You don't have to have a church. You know, it's okay. That was sanctioned by him. You can read it in the document in the State House there. So that was very different than Charles I, who got into a lot of trouble, but was much stricter in terms of how things were supposed to go and how the government, in particular Mass Bay, was to conduct themselves. The Puritans were bad in of themselves, but the English reinforced that. But, remember also that Philip saw himself as equivalent to King Charles. Okay. It was sovereign nation to sovereign nation. That's why he requested the name and why he became called king. And he was perfectly happy to negotiate directly with the king if he could, but he never really got the chance. He got to Boston a number of times, but that wasn't the same as going to England. And, it would have been different had he, imagine. In many respects, the war was in part an attempt to resolve all those differences and problems that the Bokonokets in particular could not seem to get any respect from the English. Either directly from the English people who were in charge in Plymouth and Mass Bay and Connecticut, but also the people in England, because they knew there was another power over there. But I don't know to what extent they really understood just how many people there were in England at the time, and what the other kingdoms in Europe were like, and the power it plays there. But it's a highly politically charged period of time, and you have to follow all that very closely. Other questions? Any questions about what, you satisfied with the idea of just reading as far as you want on that?
Yep.
And then we'll come back and pick up with this whole story next week. We'll have a few more people gathering with us, and
It's interesting, when the Pilgrims were in the Netherlands, they never thought about taking over that country, assimilating there, but yet when they came here, it's a whole different attitude. And the English attitude is, these are not civilized people here,
Right.
so we can consequently...
well, they didn't think the Dutch were civilized either. So, you know, for all the play about this is all about religious toleration and stuff, but forget it. The only religion that was tolerated was the Puritan. Yeah.
Well, that's why Roger Williams and Blackstone both left.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah.
We were isolated. I know Rhode Island was isolated. We were not part of the colony.
You were a very special place.
They united. We're part of
The
that.
cesspool of New England. And some people would say we haven't changed. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. And,
Thank you.